Yeah, no, you cannot get into a deficit, get into that hole, because Magnus Carlsen will make you pay. And we are going to fix the match clock on screen. Don't worry, everybody. There's a little bit more time remaining than you see there. But either way, we are off. We see that Maxime has Castle, rookie one. We're getting standard Spanish fare.
And another Marshall. We saw a fascinating line by Magnus in their fourth game, and now he does exactly the same thing. Have the players look this up during the break. See, this is what I'm always fascinated by.
And, the engines that they use, they have these supercomputers that go really in depth. So even though it says 0.4 right now, perhaps Magnus and his team looked at this, another 15 moves, saying black is actually A-okay. But bishop E3, that move closes down the file. The rook is not on E2 this time. The knight can slide behind the bishop to D2, and then you reroute it to the king set or to the B3 square, as you mentioned earlier.
And nowadays, we take engine recommendations for granted, but around 2004, 2005, very often engines gave incredibly misleading evaluations. There was a famous story during Vladimir Kramnik's World Championship match against Peter Leko in Brissago 2004. This was actually in a Marshall. Kramnik's team plugged in a position, and they let the computer sit for about a minute. Famously, Leko's team plugged in the same position and let the computer sit for about a minute and 10 seconds. And it turned out that in those additional 10 seconds, the computer changed its evaluation from winning for white to winning for black. And it was indeed completely winning for black. And Peter Leko won that game in one-sided fashion. Nowadays, even if you leave the computer for 3 or 4 seconds, it's normally going to give you a pretty accurate evaluation. But that wasn't always the case, folks.
It was not, and right now Magnus, he may be down a pawn, but he strikes with b4. He's saying knight on b1, not going to d2 just yet. The c3 pawn will fall. So if you take on b4, then the bishop just takes back, and you similarly can't develop the knight so easily. So rook c1, black controls the e file, white controls the c file, and Danya, it is an extra pawn. White has a 2-on-1 advantage on the queen side, and the bishop on b7 would much prefer to be on the f5 square.
And there's a high probability that this position eventually transforms into an opposite-colored bishop middle game or endgame, as their previous game in this line did. We remind you that Magnus won that game with an endgame masterclass, as you called it. For the time being, white is keeping his knight alive. Now, where is this knight going to go? Are we going to chill on d2 if you're MVL, or is he going to try to go around to c5? Who benefits in the event of a bishop for knight trade?
I think that you would like to get the knight to c5, and what Magnus would like to do is place the pawn, I was going to say on a4.
On a4.
a5 before, I could say it. But knight b3, there could be a queen b5 as well. There's also the opportunity to play a4, but as you're highlighting, the knight does, at long last, get into the c5 square, and does that provide real winning chances? That's the ultimate question.
It's like those movie scenes where the door is closing or the gate is slowly closing and the good guy is rushing to get in before it does. So the question for white, do you allow a4? Maybe that's a good thing for white. Maybe MVL says, hey, that was misdirection the entire time. I don't think so. I think he was calculating queen b5, and I think it's likely that Magnus plays it.
Okay, so queen b5, knight c5. The good news for white is that even if you lose b2, you're just maintaining material equality. But I just feel like Maxime hasn't found his footing in this opening. Magnus, look at him on camera there. He is chillaxed.
Oh, totally chillaxed. He's fine. He's up by 2 points. He knows that he just won an incredibly important game, a gift by MVL. So this is what makes him so terrifying. A lot of players would be nervous. I got to keep my lead. Magnus just becomes more and more relaxed.
He does indeed. And rook takes c5. If you took with the pawn on c5, there could have been some d4 shots opening that bishop on the long diagonal. So he takes with the rook to keep the bishop closed down. White remains a pawn ahead. The pawn on b2 is fixed. Black's pieces are healthily situated. We might just see more and more trades.
Healthily situated. I'm going to steal that phrase. Robert, I'm pretty healthily situated today. How do you feel?
George Carlin would hate that phrase. He'd be like, what are this wording and excess terminology? But right now, look at this move.
A near miss. Hey, call it a near hit. A near hit.
Rook takes d5 is a huge blunder. It looks like a free pawn. But after rook takes c1, there's rook c1 check to follow.
Let's show that an instructive line. And you can take us through, Robert. Rook e1 check. That's just the start of white's problems. What now?
Bishop f1, and after the king goes back, not bishop e2. Bishop e2 would have won the queen, but bishop h3 is checkmate and won.
This would have won the game, but bishop h3 just demonstrates the crucial importance of weak squares in opposite colored bishop positions. So white has to remain on top here. Let's see how MVL tries to make the most out of this extra pawn. I'm skeptical. I feel like Magnus, he's got both of the queenside pawns on light squares. The bishop is traveling to c4. I think he'll hold this together.
Yeah, I do as well. And one thing that's very important, especially in blitz chess, is king safety. Black's king is tucked away at home, no risk whatsoever. And now White's king has no risk because the major pieces are coming off. So this looks like a queen trade bound to happen, and a draw would certainly be the case if the queens come off. Queen b8, queen b7, something like that. As long as Magnus doesn't drop a pawn, it's just an even position.
The funny thing is you could probably even afford to lose the d5 pawn. If the queens are traded there, you put the bishop on d5. It's healthily situated on d5, and White will not be able to make progress. Queen b7, I think. MBL maybe wants queen d6, so he still wants to orchestrate some shenanigans with his queen. But I think you called it, Robert. You actually have to be careful. I know it sounds crazy, but if a bishop lands on h3, you could get checkmated like within a millisecond. Things could turn around.
And queen b1 back to e4, put on the yo-yo string, already looks like a drawing mechanism. But perhaps Magnus wants to play king h7 and then get his bishop out, queen in on the light squares. Like, if that queen lands on f3, White already might be lost.
Oh, absolutely. Queen f3 and bishop h3. That's the classic lobster pincer construction. And b3 by MBL, exploiting the fact that queen b1 check relinquishes the contact with the bishop. So White's going to have a pass pawn here. And I think this is a good practical chance for MBL. How do you think Magnus is going to respond?
King h7.
Oh, queen b1, queen b1, queen e4, I think is still a perpetual. Does White have f3 there?
That's the problem, but there's queen c2 check, and then actually White loses.
Oh, is that worth showing?
Yeah, it's definitely worth showing.
Analysis board. Oh, never mind. He's
it
done
might just happen. It might just happen, so we don't need to show it. F3 here would be a very bad move, not because a queen takes bishop, but because queen c2 check protects the bishop on c8 and attacks the b3 pawn.
Exactly. Very good point. Magnus is going to take a little bit of time, but we know what he's going to do. No reason to do anything crazy for Black here. He's going to keep his 2-point lead and a solid draw with the black pieces, holding his own in the opening.
Is he thinking about playing queen c2 here?
No way.
And then after b takes a4, king h7? He could try to play for a win. It's not out of the question.
Nah, but I think he would do it if he wasn't up by 2 in the match.